we often counterpoise these to each other as if they're two separate domains, right? There's the domain of faith, and there you have to know things through revealed truth, Scripture. Those who weren't around when that Scripture was written, presumably through the actual Christ event, seeing the guy, spending time with him, being influenced by him. And then there's reason, and reason is something purely natural. You don't need faith at all in order to make it work. But what is this? This is a particular philosophical perspective, isn't it? It's also a particular theological perspective. And it may be one that a lot of people assume. And in our society, it's sort of the de facto starting point. But if you're really doing good philosophy or good theology, do you make a lot of assumptions like that without spelling them out? Or without arguing for them? Or seeing whether they're actually the case? What do you think? Is theology just, well, I happen to think this, we'll go from there? See some heads shaking. What do you do? How do you tell whether this is actually a well worked out distinction, whether things are so cut and dry as that? Well, what do you do? I mean, this is something that, as theologians, all of you will have to grapple with. How many of you have thought much about the divide between faith and reason at this point? Some are. Some are nodding. What have you made of it? Some people would say as soon as you start doing theology, you're on the side of faith, and you may use reason a little bit to reason from faith, but that's not really using reason in its full extent. Do you buy that? Some people would say that over here is philosophy, and over here is theology. And how is theology different than just plain old religious life? Well, in theology, you begin from faith, and then you do a little bit of, or maybe a lot of, reasoning, but you always just begin from faith, and whenever it gets to a difficult point, and reason doesn't supply, well, just go right back to faith. And so faith becomes sort of like a stopgap, sort of like duct tape. Faith holds it all together and makes it work, but it's ultimately not the same thing as what it is that you're trying to put together. Does that sound right to you? Does that jive with your actual practice?
I don't know, for me, I've been doing some work with epistemology and theology lately. And Reinhard Huter and Paul Griffiths,
reason and the reasons of faith. Yeah,
they talk about faith. I think helpfully say that it's reason has this assent to an extra either tradition or in this case the gospel and the tradition of the church.
Yeah.
So that's and I think where the Aquinas talks about it is in belief and faith as an act of both the intellect and the will.
Yes.
Which I think is a very helpful way of talking about it. So it's reason along with the will of assent to an extra source of authority. And reason working within that.
And Aquinas is actually within a tradition. Anselm says some similar things about faith without doing it as systematically as Aquinas does, talking about different senses of the term faith. There's faith as belief in, and then there's faith as striving towards. There's a practical aspect to faith. And Anselm unpacks the discussion about dead faith in terms of belief just on its own, without actually having any sort of striving, any doing, would be dead faith. Now notice what he does in that. He takes a scriptural passage or a scriptural idea and then unpacks it. Here's something to think about. You can approach this on two sides. First of all, reason. Now if you actually believe in God, and you actually believe in creation out of nothing, was reason around in any sort of human sense before God created the universe and human beings? No, right? I mean, reason was around in the sense that God is rational. and actually within the Christian tradition, church fathers all the way through to people like Aquinas, God is reason itself. As a matter of fact, human reason is not totally rational. This is a point that Griffith actually makes in his contribution in that book. And our reason is a created reason. If you accept the notion that there is a creation, created by a providentially ordering, loving creator, that's actually going to have effects on what you think reason is. So there's not even going to be a full agreement between secularists and Christian philosophers on what reason constitutes. What about on this side? Is Scripture just a bunch of revealed truths that are sort of thrown out irrationally as starting points for us? Or can you think of the canon of Scripture? Is there anything like philosophy in Scripture?
Paul
Yeah. Paul actually makes some epistemological points about the nature of wisdom. What else? There's a whole set of Old Testament literature that we call what? The wisdom literature. And did they have philosophical schools? Like Plato? Not exactly. But they're carrying out reasoning, aren't they? So there is reasoning within the ambit of faith. Now, if we go beyond just Scripture, and then we talk about tradition with a sort of capital T, all of that includes reasoning that's done within the ambit of faith. And there's what you could call this is probably a term that you came across, dialectic, a back and forth between reason and faith. And if you accept that sort of understanding, reason can't fully develop unless it's brought into some sort of positive, or you might say respectful dialogue with faith, or perhaps even a conflictual dialogue. Sometimes even conflict can be quite good in that sense, right? Think of the book of Job. They hash things out. That's actually a book of philosophy, too, by the way. They're making philosophical arguments about the nature of the universe, about moral evil, about how things work, and they're trying to convince each other. On the other hand, faith is also tied in with reason. What kind of creatures did God make us? If we accept, sort of the biblical creation view, what kind of creatures did He make us? Just like the dogs and crawling things, or did He make us any different than that?
in His image.
Yeah, it's a big one, right there. That's a difference that transforms everything. I was just reading, this is sort of an aside, I was just reading Clement of Alexandria's Exhortation to the Heathen last week, and I'm a collector of passages about what it means to be created in the image of God. That's one of the things that I'm interested in as a philosopher, in these passages. How do they interpret them? What does Aquinas say? Well, God is rational. If we're rational, that's how we're created in the image of God. René Descartes, later in modern philosophy, God has infinite will. We have infinite will. That's how we're created in the image of God. Clement actually says, he talks about music, and he says that, I can't remember the exact phrase, he says that man is the image of God, or human beings created in the image of God, were created to be sort of like musical instruments. Because God Himself engages in harmony and engages in music. Beautiful way to think about it. Do any other animals appreciate music? Do we know? I mean, snakes, the snake charmer, he's actually just going back and forth, and the snake is bobbing back and forth. The snake doesn't appreciate music. How many of you have dogs or cats? The dogs go back and forth to music? Maybe.
But it could be though
I think they enjoy it. I mean,
well, they
depending on
respond
the
to their
pet.
owners too.
Yeah, they respond.
And we may be leading them.
Maybe it's a transitional emotion.
Yeah, and they might dislike certain kinds of music if we play them too loud. If we play them too close to their ears. But they don't have that sort of grounding. We as human beings are different, and reason is part of what we are. It's how we get to know everything. Again, if you accept a Christian view on things, how is reason not going to be tied in with faith? So this is all just background for these debates. Now, I'm going to make a transition and talk about some actual positions that people took on the possibility of Christian philosophy and the connection between theology and philosophy that were possible. You had these people called rationalists in France. And here in America, we would probably just call them secularists. And this is a very broad stance that takes a lot of different forms. Not everybody adopted the exact same position as Emile Breillat and Leon Brunschwig did in the debates, but you can see similar things being said even today. Breillat said there can't be any Christian philosophy, and why not? He's assuming a very rigid distinction between faith and reason. He says, well, what would Christian philosophy be? There could only be two possibilities. Either it could be a philosophy that's approved by some sort of, he calls it a magisterium, because again, he's thinking in Catholic France, right? And the magisterium in the Catholic Church is sort of the ultimate arbiter when there's debates about, is this part of the faith, is this not part of the faith? He chooses that term, but he points out that every religious community, if it's going to remain coherent, has some sort of body who decides. Somebody actually lays down the law. And so there would be some philosophical positions that would be acceptable and other ones that wouldn't. But would this be philosophy anymore? If philosophy is subject to some outside influence like that, well, then reason is no longer what we call autonomous. That means it's no longer getting to decide for itself. Really what you're just doing then is theology. You're not doing philosophy anymore. Right here would say. So that doesn't work as Christian philosophy. So he says, well, what else? Could we find any cases where Christianity has made some vital contribution to the development of philosophy? Or think about more broadly to human thought at its greatest. Was there really something else going on? And so Breillat looks at a lot of different examples, and he says, well, what about the church fathers and Augustine? Well, all they're really doing is warmed over Plato through Plotinus. And they're kind of mixing in some Christian imagery with it. That's what he says. How about Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas is just doing the same thing with Aristotle. There's the philosophy part of Thomas Aquinas, which is the Aristotle, and then there's the Christian part. And there he's just doing theology, and that's not interesting. The philosophy part is just Aristotle with some extra faith stuff thrown in. What about Christian philosophers in the 17th century, like Descartes? Well, how many of you have read Descartes at any time? Not too many?
Yeah.
You should read him. You should read the Meditations. Because he is the founder of modern philosophy, and he is sort of the founder of the modern worldview that we live with. This view that human reason by itself, taking faith out of the mixture, can solve everything. If you just purify reason, get rid of all your prejudices, get rid of all your assumptions, you could find some starting points, and then from those, you could find out everything and fix everything. That was Descartes' project. And that was the project that carried through the Enlightenment. Well, Descartes' clearly not doing Christian philosophy then, because the Christian stuff in Descartes is just sort of window dressing. He doesn't actually believe in anything.